This is the Nielsen Norman Group UX podcast. I'm Therese Fessenden. This episode feels a bit like time travel because all of you will be tuning in 2022 while I'm recording here in 2021 and also am mentally stuck in 2020, the year that never seems to end. But nonetheless, 2022 lies before us. And this time of year often beckons us to reflect on the past and to consider what the next year will hold. So I think it was pretty great that I got a chance to do that with the folks at User Interviews who host another great podcast called Awkward Silences. In this episode, you'll hear me speak with hosts Erin and JH. And we get into the weeds about how user research has changed over the past couple years, and also how in many ways it hasn't changed at all. We discussed some innovative solutions to pandemic-fueled research constraints, shifts toward inclusive and ethical research, and how researchers can further shape their own careers as they look forward into the next year. So, with that, here are Erin May and JH Forster. All right, well, thanks for joining us. We've got Erin and JH with us from Awkward Silences, which is very exciting. How are you guys doing today?
Nice and awkward. I'm ready. Yep.
Yeah, doing well.
Awesome. Yeah, so you guys host this awesome podcast at User Interviews called Awkward Silences, which can we just say that title is excellent, especially when your main topic is about interviews and research and things do in fact get pretty awkward. But really celebrating that, I think is great. So that said, though, you're more than podcast guests, and I think it's important, to share what you do and like the important roles that you currently play at User Interviews.
Yeah, you want me to jump in here?
So
I can take it. So I'm JH. I head up the product team at User Interviews, so product management and product design, and I've been with the team now for a little over 4 years, and started as the only person doing all of those things, and right now we have a team of 8 with a couple open recs, so we'll be at 11 soon. And so yeah, really just trying to figure out what our users need and how we can deliver that in a way that also lines up with our business goals, and doing the standard product thing and trying to make sure there's a lot of research as a part of that as well.
Yes, of course. And I mean, naturally, the brand is very much research. Yeah.
Yeah, and similar story to JH. I joined just a few months after he did, about 4 years ago. Was a marketing team of 1 for a year. Fast forward 4 years, I've got a marketing team as well as a growth team, which kind of sits at the intersection of marketing and product. We've got growing teams on both sides, hiring more. So definitely, check out our careers page and join us. It's been a lot of fun, and it's been great to incorporate user research into the work that we do, both on the marketing and growth team, and learn a lot about the practice by doing it. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah. And I imagine that being that your user base is a lot of UX researchers, you probably have a really good sense of what is kind of current in terms of UX research trends. So what would you say is the biggest change that you've seen over the last few years since you guys have joined?
It's a good question. I'll take COVID out because obviously that's been like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I can take it out, but obviously that's changed a lot of things in a number of ways, especially in the last year or two. The one that came to mind for me first is I feel like when we really started the podcast and we were talking to people, a few years back, there was a lot more concern or discussion around how you kind of prove the ROI of research. Like, how do you try to quantify it and do that? And I think there's been a little bit of a shift where there's like more acceptance or belief that research is valuable in like these intangible and kind of difficult to measure ways. And so I've heard a little bit less of that from the people we speak to, and more kind of shifting towards like the practicality or the pragmatic side of like, well, then how do we do research in a way that fits into our processes, or has the right turnaround time, or is really focused on specific decisions and not just generalized type things. So there's something there that I've seen a bit over the last few years. I don't know, Erin, if you would agree.
I definitely agree. I think, when you think of the sort of maturity spectrum, it's certainly matured. There's certainly more UX research happening, which means people are now talking about research ops and research impact, and not do we need this at all, but how do we get more out of it? So without a doubt, that's definitely happening. I think another thing that's happening is just an emphasis on this because of COVID, because of social justice issues and a lot of things happening in the world, and tech's undeniable importance and role in the world we live in. There are a lot of overdue conversations happening about diversity, equity, inclusion, ethical design. It was not happening 4 years ago when I joined User Interviews, but it is happening a lot more now, and you're starting to see real action come out of it. So that's been great to see as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a great one.
absolutely. Yeah. And actually thinking about that, you bring up an excellent point, which is that UX has really evolved as a practice and as a field, not just in how we do design, but also in how we run research, and the fact that research is now valued in, a much greater way. But it is interesting to hear too that you're seeing this trend toward inclusive research, it sounds like. Um, so yeah, could you share a little bit about that? Like, what are some of the shifts that really help to make research more inclusive?
Yeah, well, I think, it's as with the sort of maturity of the field in general, there's the awareness, and then there's this progression of, okay, I've recognized that I have an issue, or that there's something I need to do here. Okay, now what am I going to do about it? So I feel like we're at the stage where it's commonly known and recognized that there are major gaps in terms of inclusion and accessibility, and that there are some great examples of companies who are doing this really well. And there are now more and more apps and tools that are making it easier to make your product more accessible. So there's less and less of an excuse to not do it. And I
Hmm.
think also there's more of an emphasis on progress over perfection, right? Like,
Mm.
you're not going to get called out for doing an imperfect job of trying, and that advocates for accessibility and inclusion will recognize your positive attempts to do better, and not sort of call you out for being imperfect. And so I think, much as sort of agile and sprint and these kind of methodologies of just get a little bit better all the time apply to how we build products, they also apply to how we make our products more usable, more inclusive, more ethical.
Yeah, I think an interesting example comes to mind of something that we kind of did almost as an experiment was, hey, when companies are running a lot of research on our platform, we have all this data about who they're talking to, demographics, location, characteristics, all these different things. And we went out in kind of, very manual way to ask some of those teams like, hey, if we generate a report for you that kind of shows a breakdown of like who your team's talking to, and if there's any, trends or over indexing in certain areas, like, so you can help correct that, like, would that be useful? And we got a really tremendous response from that. So we haven't like productized it yet, but just in terms of like pulling those reports manually and generating them for folks, there was like a real strong positive reception to that in a way that, I don't know if a few years ago, if we'd done that, if it would have landed the same way.
That's awesome. And I do think you guys are in a really unique position where you do have all that excellent data, not just with like one company, but with many companies who are using your platform to basically recruit and organize and essentially execute the studies in many cases. So I guess thinking about the way people are executing studies, I imagine, I know you mentioned that we're kind of ruling out COVID, um, but what have you seen in terms of, in-person versus remote studies? I know that for a while we couldn't even do in-person studies, but what are you seeing nowadays?
It's coming back a bit. I mean, we see that in our data, right? So there was a period where when COVID really first happened, and in that February, March period, at that time, probably like maybe 40% of our projects, our sessions were for in-person studies. And then, as the 2-week lockdown's going to fix everything phase came
Mhm.
out, that basically went away. Like there were just none. And we didn't really know what was going to happen. So it was kind of a scary time for us as a business. Like, is that going to shift
Mm.
to online or not? And what was interesting was, you saw some people that were kind of staunchly against, remote research of, oh, you don't get the same, camaraderie or rapport and you can't go as deep, trying it out of necessity. And I think a lot of people have actually come to find that there are some benefits to it. And
Mhm.
I'm probably going to stick with it as one of their tools going forward, even if they do bring back in person, to some degree. So I think lately it hasn't come back as strongly. I think some of the advantages of remote in terms of being able to, reach more geographies, get things scheduled a little bit faster because you don't have to wait for somebody to travel to your office or go to them or whatever the methodology requires. And so yeah, it's coming back, but it doesn't seem like it's going to come all the way back to what it was before. I don't know, Aaron, if you have any other trends.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right with all things COVID, where we were forced into remote basically everything, and a lot of people realized the advantages of that who maybe hadn't explored remote research as much before. But now we're in a period of, now there is more choice. Obviously, things are not back to where they were in terms of everything being fully open and fully safe and whatnot, but there's more option than there was when everything was remote, and everyone's just reevaluating everything, right? Like, what has served us well about this remote thing we were forced into? What have we missed by not being able to test our physical products together in person? There are cases where it's obviously much more important to have that option. And another thing I'll tell you, I heard this from a researcher, which is, I won't say who it was, but I wonder how much this happens in the market as well, where many companies have invested in very expensive labs for in person, and there's a feeling of, we got the budget for this, we need to use it,
Yeah.
and so I don't know how much that happens, but I know that things like that do happen too, where you want to make use of the budget and of the decisions you've already made for in person. So, I think there's a recalibration for sure happening. And my assumption is that remote will remain a larger percentage than it was before the pandemic, but less than it was, when it was the only option.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you do see people doing really cool and clever things, like, ingenuity certainly comes out of stuff like
Absolutely.
this, like, companies that are doing stuff with physical products, shipping stuff to people so that they can have it in their hands while they're talking to them remotely, or people working on mobile apps, having people do the kind of like bear hug the laptop thing so that your screen is in front of the webcam and they don't have to install any other software. They can still just, hop onto Zoom in their laptop and then hold their phone in a certain way so that you can see what they're doing and how they use apps. Like, people are really clever. So that's been cool to see as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess with a pandemic, we are all inevitably challenged to work within some of these constraints and still try to gather data so that we can make informed decisions about whatever it is we're designing. But I'm curious why this shift toward remote, like what about this shift to remote seems like it'll be something that'll stick around for good?
Well, we're in the recruiting business, right? We help people find the very best participants that meet whatever needs they might have. And remote just makes finding the participants you need so much more within reach, depending on what you're looking for. But if you take the geographic constraints out of it, it just means now you can talk to anyone in the world, anyone in the country who, depending on what you're looking for, maybe you have very specific criteria that are not geographic in nature. Now you can talk to all of those folks. Now you can get a wider swath of people to talk to, right? If you're building an app that's designed for every English speaker, in the world, and you're only talking to people who live in New York because that's where your company is based, you're not getting a good sampling of whatever biases or whatever usability issues, whatever it might be that are in your product, because you're only talking to people who live in New York, who are wonderful people. I'm from New York, but are not necessarily representative of every English speaker in the entire world. So
good save there, fellow New Yorker up here.
Yes.
Why do all our participants talk so fast?
Yes.
The things I would add maybe just quickly are, I think some of the other advantages, like you mentioned the lab stuff, Erin, is if you're doing it remotely, like, you can just record the video as long as you get consent and people are okay with that. And now you can just splice it up and you have these great artifacts of, you have the person there saying it in their own words, where to do that in a lab setting is, a little bit more involved in terms of how you set up the camera and audio and everything else. So I think that's just like simpler and more accessible for lots of teams. I think incentive wise, like obviously you still want to pay people a fair incentive and value their time, but when you're doing it remotely, you're not baking in like the time that they have to travel to get to your office, like both ways. And so, if you're talking to them for an hour, you can kind of just incentivize them for that hour. You don't have to, pad it a little bit because they have to, leave their workday in the middle of the day and come down for a half hour, in transit, talk to you, and then get back to their job, right? So you're going to have to pay more to do that for in person. And so you can do a little bit more with your budget. You get like, I think these better artifacts in some ways if you're using the recording tools. So some of those things I think are real advantages. And I think what people were afraid of was that like, oh, it's going to be awkward. I'm not going to be able to have the same level of connection. I'm not going to be able to get people to open up or share. And I think, being forced to do it, I think a lot of people found like, oh, we can still develop good conversational techniques such that these online sessions feel, really productive.
Yeah. And people are used to Zoom now. It used to be we would, have researchers complain a lot more about, this participant, they don't know how to use Zoom. That doesn't happen as much anymore. Everyone knows how to use Zoom now. So just the sort of comfort with using these remote tools has gone way up. So it's just easier to use them. No show rates tend to be better. It's easy to join. It's easy to find a replacement, in the last minute when you're doing remote. So it's just easier. That being said, it's not always the best way to go, but it does make life a whole lot easier. The other thing that surprised me, I heard a researcher say is, you think if you're doing, like, let's say, field ethnography kind of research, or having someone come into your lab, you have someone come into their lab, they're obviously not in their natural context.
Right.
But if you're talking to them where they live, where they reside, yes, like maybe it's a little invasive, but they are in their natural habitat, and you might get more authentic and natural sort of insight that way, which is a nice kind of benefit as well. So we're a remote company. We are, into remote. So definitely think there's tons of pros to remote research.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind with just the whole pandemic dynamic with research is we definitely heard from researchers that they've had to bring a little bit more like empathy or understanding to the conversations just because everyone is so kind of shot and burnt out from the whole thing of
Hmm.
I don't have childcare, I'm stuck in my house, I'm worried about my loved ones. Like there's just been a ton of stress and a lot of disruption for everyone. And so when you're talking to somebody, even something about something maybe like typically casual, like some consumer app or something that is, low stakes, you're going to these sessions and people are like just happy to have somebody to talk to and kind of offloading some of that stress or venting a little bit. And so, there's a little bit of meeting people there and being supportive of it, but then also on the researcher side, taking some time for yourself to recover and not kind of absorbing all that trauma and stuff and, making sure you have some of your own self-care. So we've definitely heard that type of trend from researchers as well.
Yeah, totally. And I do think the ability to take a breather is something that I always recommend whenever I'm talking to other researchers who are like, how much time should I dedicate? And it ends up being like, oh, well, we got hour-long interviews, so we can just stack them all. And I'm like, well, you might want to
Mm-hmm,
have at least
mm-hmm.
a solid 15-30 minutes, at a minimum 15, more like 30 minutes in between to just gather yourself, because it can be a really intense session, whether that's usability testing or interviews. So absolutely agree. Yeah. So when thinking about, what has changed versus like what has stayed the same, like what do you think is kind of not changed in a remarkable way or an unremarkable way?
Well, the fundamentals haven't changed, right? Good research starts with good research questions, followed
Hmm.
by, a good research design, good recruiting, good moderation, good execution, good analysis, all that. None of that's changed. So that's what comes to mind, I guess, for me first. The fundamentals have not changed. They've become more accessible. That would be a difference. I think there's so many more communities, education, content, particularly with remote, that have made it more accessible to get those fundamentals right. But the fundamentals haven't changed. What do
Yeah,
you think?
my mind went to the same place of just
Yeah.
like you still need to make sure you're doing research for the right reasons and you have a clear question or decision you're trying to make. You still got to talk to great people so that you're like learning the right things from a representative sample. Yeah, I think the way you described it, Aaron, was pretty spot on.
Yeah, and that idea of, having the right reason to do research, like I can even think of a couple times where others are, have come up to be asking what's the appropriate method, if someone wants to get feedback about like an application or
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
a website. And sometimes I get asked like, is an interview a good method for that? And it's like, well, if you're going to talk about something that people aren't looking at or using, then
Hmm.
it might not actually end up being an objective observation, or it might not necessarily be the most helpful feedback. But if you were to maybe do a usability study or do some more direct observation, then maybe you'll learn a bit more. So I totally agree. I think the fundamentals of figuring out what it is you want to learn and then structuring your study in a way that helps you to really answer those questions, even if it means what you ultimately ask isn't the same question. Structuring your interview or your interview questions or your tasks in a way that allows you to really get at the truth. I think that's absolutely, yeah, still the same, and holds true no matter what. A timeless
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah, it truly is. I don't think that will ever change. The methods will change, the speed will change, the recruiting, the details will all change, but the fundamentals won't change.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of the fundamental, like the upfront fundamentals, like what is the question we're trying to answer? What is the best methodology for that? Who needs to be involved? Is there a timeline where like we can get this done such that it's going to impact the decisions that other teams are making, or we're going to miss the boat? Like I do think a lot of that upfront planning, which doesn't mean it has to take a long time or you have to do it way in advance, but like getting a couple of those things right from the start, like puts you on the right trajectory. Otherwise, like you really drift off. You know what I mean? So like if you're thinking about like an arrow going off in space, if at the start it's a little couple degrees off, it seems close, but then like you go forward a little bit and it's veered way off. It's like that type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess related, if we're thinking about some of the mistakes or maybe some of the pitfalls that researchers may be making, maybe that's planning the study or running the study. I mean, personally, I've seen a lot of mistakes can be avoided if there's good planning, but I'm
Absolutely,
curious,
yeah.
like what you've seen.
I think, just to not hit the planning stuff since we were just doing that a little bit, we can come back to that. But I think when people are in the studies, sometimes not having like the right level of flexibility or responding to change in a way that they should, right? If you're doing like a usability study and you're showing, a new prototype or something to people and giving them a task to complete, and like the first 2 or 3 people are like bombing it and it's not even close, and you were planning to talk to like 6 or 7, you probably should make some changes like mid study before you talk to the rest of the people.
Mhm.
And like sometimes people don't do that because it's like, well, we said we're going to talk to 7 people for this, and like we got 4 more to go, so let's do it. So like, or being really strict on a script of questions and not having a little bit of like improv and space to explore interesting things that are coming up. So I think like in the study, sometimes people can be rigid in ways that's counterproductive.
Yeah, and I think we're lucky to get a lot of kind of newer researchers and people starting out using user interviews. Hopefully, because we've made it easy to get started and that sort of thing. But we do get folks who kind of will launch a recruiting project and then talk to our support folks and say, now how do I do this research? So I would just say, we have lots of great resources, and as does NNG on how to do great research, and they're wonderful communities. And Google just launched a Coursera course on UX, tons of great resources to figure out how to do research. But, recruiting is a great place to go wrong, I would say, and not many researchers get it right, certainly, but you will not get good insight from bad fit participants. You just won't. And depending on what you're trying to learn and how niche your product is, the specificity that you need from those participants may vary widely, but and depending on if you're doing discovery or usability, depending on lots of different things, what you really need will vary. But if you're not talking to the right participants, you're not going to get good insights. And I think there are definitely researchers out there that don't spend enough time thinking about who is the person that's going to have the insight that I need to learn something, and how do I go find them?
Yeah. Another lesson that comes to mind that I learned early in my career, kind of the hard way. I was, a recent college grad and setting up to do an unmoderated usability study through a, online tool, and built out the whole thing and all these different prompts and stuff. And I was like really excited about it. And so I just like fired away and I was like, all right, I'm gonna get 10 people to do this. And I got 10 people to do it really quick. And I went through those and I had messed something up in like the first prompt. And so it didn't make sense and everyone misinterpreted it. And like every single one was bad. And there was a UX researcher on the team at the time, Kirk, shout out Kirk if you're listening to this, who told me afterwards, he's like, you got to test the test. Like you have to, like, you got to QA it. You got to make sure that, the thing you're doing is actually going to work. Whether that's with one external participant to start, or, have somebody internally do it, or come to it with fresh eyes yourself. And, in just my excitement to get rolling, I just like, fired away, and it like totally didn't work as a result.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I totally agree. And I do have to say, like, having used your platform a couple times, like you guys do make it really easy to figure out like who's a good fit and who isn't. And I do think that's a really fundamental like first step to kind of talk to your point, Erin. And especially when you do have, like, for example, I had one project fairly recently where there was like a huge variety of people I needed to interview, and it was a lot. But it was also important for me to get a couple people in this particular role, a couple people in that particular role. And if I hadn't spent about 4 to 8 weeks just on ensuring I had the right kinds of people, I think I wouldn't have gotten the richness of insights I needed. But yeah, JH, to your point, also that pilot, and I actually did have like a little pilot session where I basically ran the study with 2 people, or I ran the interview with 2 people. And in that interview, I figured out a whole bunch of like, oh yeah, that's not worded well, or
Mm-hmm.
this needs to be, we need to prioritize these questions better. So we really
Mm-hmm.
need to refine this. So absolutely, that pilot study is going to make things a lot easier for the rest of the study, and I do think it's a good way to be like iterative about your research practice. So yeah, excellent points.
And you can also test the tests often yourself or with a coworker. You know, it doesn't even have to be with real participants you've recruited. A
Mhm.
lot of
Totally.
time it's just silly mistakes you didn't catch or things like that. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Now, I guess I'm curious now, looking into like the next year, what do you think researchers should be mindful of, as they are refining their practice? Maybe there's stuff that maybe new folks should consider, some stuff that maybe more UX research mature folks could consider. Could you offer some advice for folks looking into the new year?
Yeah, I think there's something for folks. If you are embracing, online research in whatever form you're doing it. But let's think about, some sort of video, whether it's moderated or unmoderated, and you're recording it and getting those artifacts. Definitely like would encourage people to look into all the great tools that have emerged around how you can like splice those up and, atomicize them and get all these different insights for future use. And so I think there's like a wide selection of tools across some of the research repository tools. Some of the video tools themselves offer this stuff. There's other ones that kind of like work with any video tool like Grain, but being able to like chop up those highlights in an easy way is really helpful. And I just know for myself, like 2 years ago when I was doing some of this with people on my team, we were downloading stuff. We were trying to do it in QuickTime. We were messing with iMovie, and it was like it just felt like a
Mhm.
burden. And now there's things that like in my browser, I'm just like dragging stuff around, and I have like a whole thing processed in like 15 minutes, and it's crazy. So if you're not using those tools, I would strongly recommend taking a look at them.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you bring up a great point. Like, I've seen a lot of research done where there are these excellent artifacts where you got participants who consent to have their video recorded and they understand that it's going to be used internally. Once we've got that consent, we've got essentially a gold mine of information that kind of sits unused in a lot of organizations. Like maybe we write about it in a short research deliverable, but I often find the best way to get buy-in for research is to actually show people the clips, like show people what people are saying. And it doesn't have to be the entire interview or the entire usability test. It could be a 15-second snapshot or a 1-minute snapshot or basically a short clip of what actually happened there. So totally agree.
Yeah, 100%.
I think in terms of advice, I don't like to give advice. I'm just a person trying my best over here, but here I go. I think, with the Great Resignation and with it being, who knows, the economy's all sorts of stuff's happening. I just read my New York Times said like the worst inflation in a generation. And
Oh yeah.
I don't know what the Fed's going to do and interest rates. And I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not going to predict that. But right now it is a labor's market, and it is it's a good time to be if you're in a position to do so, to be demanding conditions that make you happy at work, whether that is salary or benefits, whether that is standing up for something you believe in the sort of ethics front, whether it's more tooling and resources, whatever it might be. If you have experience and talent and care and drive, I mean, it is a good time to find a good job for yourself. So I would say seize the moment, seize the zeitgeist, and do your best work. It's a good time to do it.
Yeah. And to that point too, if you are, maybe crafting your current role, right? Like I think we're in a great position now where we can essentially work to create the lifestyles that we want to have. And I do think our field is unique in that we are often capable of doing it at home and to continue doing it at home. But I'm also thinking too, like just thinking about what you mentioned earlier about inclusive research. Right now, we're going to be talking to people all over the world with remote studies, and I think that's great. But it also means that we're probably going to be working weird hours, right? Because we're doing interviews with people in the Philippines, people in Europe, and that means working strange hours. But we don't have to work long hours if we work strange hours. And I do think there's an important, basically it's important to defend your boundaries and
Yeah,
keep
absolutely.
yourself sane. And really, when I say practice self-care, I mean, take care of yourself and do make sure that you're working a sustainable, in a sustainable way. So
Yeah,
totally
and I'm glad
agree.
you brought up self-care because, we had Vivian Castillo on the show a while ago, and she's really advocated for this. And I think we've also moved the dialogue forward on self-care, where I think it used to be, go to the spa and massage, that kind of thing. Nothing wrong with any of that, of course.
Of
But
course.
really, it's about creating boundaries. It's about saying no, about saying this is what I need to not get burnt out and to bring my full self to work and all of that. And I think that's where we are in the self-care conversation, which is great. That ought to be hopefully accessible to a lot of people to create better boundaries for themselves. And to your point, maybe I'm working weird hours. Maybe I don't need to do that every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you are like in a remote role, like for yourself working that way, I say this to my team a lot. Like, I think there's kind of two ways of doing it. There's kind of like basic mode where you do 9 to 5 and you figure out some ways to set boundaries there. So, you work in a different place of your house, or, you take your slippers off, or, you do something, right, to like demarcate the day and try to hold yourself to
Mhm.
that and turn off. But I think there's also kind of like the advanced mode where kind of what you're describing, where you can get into working strange hours out of necessity because you need to talk to somebody in a different location, or it works better with your life that day, and like you have that flexibility now. And I have found that it's you got to be mindful of like the total amount you're working and boundaries and stuff. But I really like that version. Like, I was up early this morning because my kids were up, and got a hour of work done from like 7 to 8, and then I kind of started my day late so I could go out for a run when the sun was up. And other days I wrap up early, and then I'll close out my inbox while I watch a TV show at, the end of the night. And so like, I like that flexibility, but it can be a slippery slope if you're not good about being mindful about like how much you're working and keeping like a balanced ledger, so to speak.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to set up boundaries for yourself.
Absolutely. Well, this has been fun and inspiring. And I think I learned a lot, both about what the current state of research is, as well as, what's really going to take research to the next level in the year forward and maybe years to come. So yeah, thanks for being here with us today. If you have, do you have social media channels or other places you could point people to? Obviously, I know there's the Awkward Silences podcast, but please, yeah, share if there's any places that, our audience could follow your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are at User Interviews on Twitter. JH, what's your Twitter handle?
JH Forster.
Cool. I'm at Erin H. May. We're User Interviews. We're on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. And if you check out User Interviews /awkward, you can get 3 free participants there if that's of interest. So check us out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I gotta say, it has been so fun to work with you guys, both on this podcast and outside of it. But yeah, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you guys for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
That was Erin and JH from Awkward Silences by User Interviews. As they mentioned, there are loads of resources, both on the User Interviews website and on the Nielsen Norman Group website. And in fact, I just published an article on how to recruit and screen research participants, which I've linked in the show notes. So if you're about to embark on a research study and you don't know where to start, check out the links in our show notes. Also, we have a virtual 5-day qualitative research series running from April 4th to 8th, where you can sharpen your qualitative research skills. Or if the 2 half-day format is more your cup of tea, then our next conference is January 8th through 21. To find articles, videos, and learning opportunities like these, check out nngroup.com. That's nngroup.com. This episode was produced and hosted by me, Therese Fessenden, and all editing and post-production is by Jonas Zellner. But most importantly, these episodes are only possible with your support. So if you want to continue to support us and the work that we do, please hit subscribe, and if you can, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening today, and we wish you a belated Happy New Year. Until next time, remember, keep it simple.